Colonel Andreas von Aulock checked his watch. Just after 900 hours, August 17, 1944. Inside the bunker beneath Saint-Malo, the bombardment had ended. Not faded, not slowed, ended. The sudden quiet pressed against his ears harder than the shells ever had. For 8 days the American guns had spoken without interruption. Day merged into night. The earth pulsed like a living thing. Concrete shuddered. Lamps swayed. Dust sifted down from the ceiling in pale curtains. Men flinched at every impact until flinching became useless. Some bled from the ears. Some stopped hearing entirely. And then, abruptly, nothing. No thunder, no concussion, only wind sliding through distant corridors and the measured rhythm of his own breath. Von Aulock felt calm. He trusted numbers. He trusted engineering. Above him lay 10 feet of reinforced concrete poured to exact specifications. He knew the penetration tables. He knew the limits of American artillery. High explosive relied on force and mass. Force dissipated against thickness. Thickness favored the defender. He had sent his message to Berlin hours earlier. The position holds, losses acceptable, morale steady. He meant every word. What he had calculated was impact, velocity, shock. He had prepared for steel meeting stone. He had not prepared for chemistry. He did not know that at that same moment, American P-38 Lightnings were descending through the haze offshore, carrying cylinders filled with a substance that ignored walls, ignored angles, ignored fortifications entirely. A weapon that did not need to break concrete because it turned air itself into an instrument of death. Von Aulock was no zealot. He was a career officer, born in 1993, shaped by institutions rather than slogans. He entered the army before the Kaiser fell and never truly left it. Discipline was his faith. Order was his creed. Ideology passed above him like weather. In the First World War, he learned arithmetic measured in bodies and meters gained at impossible cost. He survived because he learned quickly and obeyed precisely. Survival reinforced belief. In the years that followed, he served wherever he was sent: Poland, France, Africa. Under Rommel, he absorbed the value of preparation and the cruelty of logistics. He watched victories evaporate when supply lines snapped. He watched courage fail when material ran out. He adapted. He endured. At Kuban, his defenses had broken repeated Soviet assaults. Trenches held, wire held, men held. He earned his decorations not through speeches, but through results. On August 16th, the honor arrived. Oak leaves to the Knight's Cross. Approval from Hitler himself. The message carried weight. The Atlantic Wall needed symbols, and Saint-Malo had become one. Engineers had transformed an ancient fortress into a modern citadel. Tunnels layered beneath stone. Firing positions overlapped with geometric precision. Hillsides concealed guns aimed at the approaches. Thousands of tons of concrete poured over years. Inside were 3,000 seasoned soldiers, many hardened on the Eastern Front, men who understood deprivation and loss. The Americans had tried to break him with weight: heavy howitzers, massive shells, bombers dropping explosives by the ton. Buildings collapsed, streets vanished, but the core endured. No decisive breach, no collapse. Even a daring penetration into the inner courtyard had achieved nothing. Confusion, rubble, retreat. The fortress remained closed. By the morning of the 17th, certainty replaced confidence. Von Aulock believed the Americans had reached the edge of their capabilities. Infantry bled above ground. Time favored the defender. Relief would come, or negotiations, or orders to withdraw. The math favored patience. He did not yet understand that the silence was not defeat. It was transition.
The guns had stopped because the problem had changed. The Americans were no longer trying to break the fortress. They were about to erase it.
He was wrong. The Americans had not exhausted their ammunition. They had exhausted the relevance of shells. For 8 days they had measured the fortress, learned its reactions, charted its tolerances. Every barrage had been a question. Every silence had been an answer. And by the morning of August 17th, the Americans no longer needed to ask. They had solved the equation. At 11:30 a.m., the character of the battlefield changed. The air itself changed. Not the distant thunder of heavy bombers droning at altitude, not the slow concussion of artillery echoing across the peninsula. This sound was sharper, closer, a rising mechanical whine that grew louder by the second. Twin engines, high speed, low altitude. Spotters on the citadel called it in immediately. Aircraft approaching from the north, fast movers, fighters, P-38 Lightnings. Von Aulock listened to the report without concern. Fighter bombers were harassment weapons, precision tools, not siege breakers. They carried light payloads, 500-pound bombs at most. Against 10 feet of reinforced concrete, such weapons were irrelevant. He had already survived bombardment from guns capable of flattening city blocks. A few fighter sorties meant nothing. But something about the report unsettled him. The aircraft were flying unusually low, lower than doctrine suggested, and the spotters reported an odd configuration beneath their wings, not standard bomb racks, instead large teardrop-shaped objects, external fuel tanks, oversized, unpainted, modified. Fuel tanks. Von Aulock frowned. Fuel tanks were dropped to extend range, not to attack fortifications. The logic made no sense. He moved to the observation slit and watched as the aircraft aligned with the fortress, banking sharply, diving almost directly toward the stone. The tanks separated. They did not fall cleanly. They tumbled, wobbled, unguided. They made no whistling sound, no scream of descending steel. They simply fell. Von Aulock expected impact, a dull clang against rock, perhaps a harmless explosion of residual fuel. What he saw instead defied every rule of warfare he understood. The world turned orange. Not an explosion, a sudden expansion of light and heat, a rolling wave of fire that spread outward rather than upward, a sound like a furnace door opening at full blast. The tanks ruptured on impact, releasing hundreds of gallons of thickened fuel that sprayed across stone and concrete in every direction, and then it ignited. The fire did not behave like fire. It did not leap skyward and dissipate. It flowed, it crawled, it clung. It poured across surfaces like molten metal. It rolled down walls, seeped into cracks, spilled into embrasures and firing slits. It burned with intent. Von Aulock watched machine gun positions disappear, not destroyed, not blasted apart, but simply abandoned. Men fled their posts screaming. Some did not make it out. The fire stuck to them. Uniforms ignited. Flesh burned beneath fabric. The more they struggled, the deeper the fire adhered. This was not heat. This was chemistry. The substance coating his fortress had been developed not by soldiers, but by scientists, in laboratories, at universities. It was called napalm, a petroleum-based incendiary thickened with aluminum soaps, designed to adhere to surfaces and burn at extreme temperatures for extended durations. Von Aulock did not know its name. He did not need to. He saw its effects. The outer perimeter collapsed in minutes. Inside the bunkers, men began to choke, not burned, not wounded, suffocating. The ventilation system, carefully engineered to sustain life under bombardment, was now betraying them.
The fires outside consumed oxygen at an extraordinary rate, creating a powerful vacuum. The vents drew smoke inward, replacing breathable air with thick, toxic fumes. Reports flooded the command post, men collapsing, men gasping, men unconscious. The bunkers were becoming sealed chambers of smoke. Von Aulock understood then, with horrifying clarity, what his fortress had become. Not a stronghold, a kiln.
He had built a system optimized to resist pressure and shock. The Americans had introduced a weapon that bypassed pressure entirely. It did not attack walls, it attacked air. And there was no countermeasure. Von Aulock issued orders out of habit more than hope. Seal the vents, close the intake shafts, flood the corridors. None of it worked. The metal grates covering the ventilation inlets glowed red, then sagged, then melted entirely. Smoke continued to pour inward, thick and oily, coating lungs and eyes and skin. Men ran for exits. They believed fresh air waited outside. What they found was worse. The smoke beyond the doors was denser than inside. Fire rolled across the stone like a living thing. Those who stepped into it did not return. Some tried to fight the fire. Water was poured onto the burning gel. It burned on the surface of the water. Earth was shoveled over it. The fire crept across the dirt and emerged unextinguished. Blankets were thrown. They ignited instantly. The napalm did not care. Inside the command bunker, officers removed their caps and loosened collars as the air grew heavy. Eyes burned, throats closed, breathing became work. A captain staggered in with a final report from the outer galleries. Half the garrison was incapacitated. Many were dead without visible wounds. Von Aulock looked around the room. These were professional soldiers, men who had survived Stalingrad, men who had endured starvation, encirclement, artillery barrages that erased entire divisions. They understood what was happening. They understood there would be no relief. This was not a tactical setback. It was extinction. He imagined the next wave of aircraft targeting the central ventilation shaft, the one feeding the command bunker itself. If that intake was ignited, everyone inside would be dead within minutes. No armor, no concrete, no discipline could prevent it. At approximately 1600 hours, the white flag was raised. The fortress that had withstood more than 8,000 artillery shells surrendered not to destruction, but to suffocation. It fell not by force, but by denial of air. When von Aulock emerged from the citadel, he did so as he had lived his entire career, uniform immaculate, medal in place, cane in hand. He walked upright, eyes forward, but the illusion of certainty was gone. He passed blackened concrete walls, scorched not by blast, but by heat so intense the stone itself had been altered. Firing slits were charred voids. Inside, weapons lay melted into unrecognizable shapes. Steel sagged, aluminum had pooled and hardened like wax. Bodies were carried out on stretchers, no blood, no shrapnel wounds, faces calm, lungs empty of oxygen. Men who had been safe moments earlier behind the strongest fortifications in Europe. Of the original garrison of 3,000, just over 600 remained capable of walking. Many coughed violently. Their eyes were inflamed from chemical exposure. Burns marked their skin where the fire had touched them. These were the survivors of the Atlantic Wall's most advanced fortress. Von Aulock had spent 37 years mastering fortification theory. He had believed that with sufficient engineering, any position could be held. He had proven it repeatedly: Kuban, Crimea, the Eastern Front. But here, all that knowledge collapsed. He had encountered a truth no academy taught. Walls are meaningless when the enemy attacks oxygen.
Concrete is irrelevant when fire behaves like liquid. Courage cannot function in the absence of air. Saint-Malo was no longer a fortress, it was a demonstration. American engineers would later inspect the ruins. They would note ventilation shafts transformed into chimneys of death, bunkers intact yet lethal, a structure defeated without being destroyed. Napalm exceeded expectations. Its effects were immediate, devastating, systemic. The age of the impregnable fortress ended that day. Von Aulock spent the remainder of the war in captivity. He had time to think, time to replay the moment when the assumptions of his entire profession collapsed, time to understand that Saint-Malo had not fallen because of failure, it had fallen because of progress.
Across Europe, other commanders would learn the same lesson. Fortresses, once considered eternal, would crumble, not from assault, but from obsolescence. Static defense had no answer to a nation that could convert chemistry into weaponry. The Second World War was not being decided by bravery. It was not being decided by tactical brilliance. It was being decided by laboratories, factories, and supply chains capable of turning scientific theory into mass-produced destruction. Napalm was only one example. Radar, proximity fuses, jet propulsion, synthetic materials, each innovation bypassed tradition, each rendered experience less relevant. The battlefield was no longer a test of men, it was a test of systems. Von Aulock had defended Saint-Malo as well as any human could. That was the point. Excellence was no longer enough. The fortress concept died not because it failed, but because it succeeded too narrowly. It had been designed for a war that no longer existed. Saint-Malo proved there was no such thing as an impregnable position, no thickness sufficient, no geometry clever enough, no discipline strong enough to survive an enemy that could weaponize fire itself. The Americans did not defeat German soldiers, they defeated German assumptions. The fall of the fortress echoed beyond Brittany. It marked a transition, the moment when warfare crossed fully into the industrial age, when courage became a variable rather than a virtue, when survival depended not on walls but on production capacity. Von Aulock would carry that understanding with him for the rest of his life, the knowledge that 37 years of study had been overtaken by a single innovation, that a fortress could be cooked from the outside in. Saint-Malo fell in hours, but the idea it destroyed had stood for centuries. Industrial power had spoken. By the end of August 1944, one truth was impossible to ignore. Fortresses no longer decided wars. Concrete, steel, and courage had reached their limit. The future belonged to nations that could turn science into weapons and factories into battlefields. Napalm was only one example. Radar, proximity fuses, jet propulsion, synthetic materials, each innovation bypassed tradition, each rendered experience less relevant. The battlefield was no longer a test of men, it was a test of systems. Von Aulock had defended Saint-Malo as well as any human could. That was the point. Excellence was no longer enough. The fortress concept died not because it failed, but because it succeeded too narrowly. It had been designed for a war that no longer existed. Saint-Malo proved there was no such thing as an impregnable position, no thickness sufficient, no geometry clever enough, no discipline strong enough to survive an enemy that could weaponize fire itself. The Americans did not defeat German soldiers, they defeated German assumptions. The fall of the fortress echoed beyond Brittany. It marked a transition, the moment when warfare crossed fully into the industrial age, when courage became a variable rather than a virtue, when survival depended not on walls but on production capacity. Von Aulock would carry that understanding with him for the rest of his life,
the knowledge that 37 years of study had been overtaken by a single innovation, that a fortress could be cooked from the outside in.
Saint-Malo fell in hours, but the idea it destroyed had stood for centuries. Industrial power had spoken. By the end of August 1944, one truth was impossible to ignore. Fortresses no longer decided wars. Concrete, steel, and courage had reached their limit. The future belonged to nations that could turn science into weapons and factories into battlefields. Saint-Malo was not an exception, it was a warning. Thank you for watching. If this story resonated with you, the moment a disciplined commander realized that engineering cannot outlast chemistry, like the video and subscribe for more World War II stories that reveal how modern warfare was truly shaped. Share your thoughts in the comments. Had you ever heard about napalm being used against European fortresses? Where are you watching from today? And what other forgotten battles, technologies, or decisions should we uncover next? Your support allows us to continue telling the stories where history, science, and human belief collide, and where old ideas fall apart under the weight of industrial power.